and well-being are intimately connected to our environment. Climate change is considered one of the most significant threats our species has ever faced. It's not just an issue for the future, it's happening now. There are many negative effects on both our physical and mental health because of climate change, but there are things that we can do about it, both for the environment and for our own well-being. Please welcome Dr. Brad Dibble, cardiologist from the Royal Victoria Regional Health Centre in Pace Cardiology. Dr. Dibble is Barrie born and raised, woohoo! And he attended Barrie North Collegiate, graduating top of his class and serving as valedictorian. He received his medical degree from Western Ontario, now Western University, in London, Ontario, where he stayed to complete his cardiology training. He started his practice in Barrie in 1996. Outside cardiology, Dr. Dibble also has an interest in climate crisis and has been appointed by the Federal Minister of the Environment, the late Jim Prentice, as one of 25 members to the Sustainable Development Advisory Council, a membership he still maintains. He has written a book on the subject entitled Comprehending the Climate Crisis, which has won awards and has been endorsed by former Canadian astronaut Colonel Chris Hadfield. Dr. Dibble received training from former Vice President and Nobel laureate Al Gore in San Francisco in August 2012, allowing him to provide versions of Mr. Gore's climate talk to Canadians. He now serves as a mentor for the Climate Reality Canada. Welcome, Dr. Dibble.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and thanks everyone for this opportunity. I'm just going to dive right into it because we only have so much time to try and cover a pretty large topic, but I've divided this into 3 different sections. We're going to go through the background science to make sure you understand why the climate is changing. Then we'll talk about the impacts of climate change, primarily focused on the impacts on our health, because that's really what this crisis is all about. And then some of the solutions. We'll go over some brief topics to cover both things that society can do and things that we can do. So the background science really starts with the fact that you have to appreciate a little bit of basic physics. White light is really all the colors of the rainbow. In fact, if we have a prism, like the little water droplets in the rain, we can see that ourselves with a rainbow. But when you look at something that's red, what that means is the red color was reflected back to you, but everything else was absorbed by that object, in this case, an apple. So if you look at something that's white, everything is reflected back. If you look at something that's black, none of it is. And if you look at something that has color, like red or green, only those colors are reflected back and everything else is absorbed. What happens to that absorbed light energy? Most of it just becomes heat. Although in a green plant, that might use some of that energy for photosynthesis, which is important because that provides energy for the plant, and critters that eat those plants get energy from that, and critters that eat those critters that eat those plants get energy from that. But by and large, it turns into heat. Now, heat is actually part of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's lower in the energy level, so it's below the visible light spectrum. But if you feel heat off, say, a burner on your stove, that's actually radiating infrared. Now, there's some interesting properties that we've taken advantage of with that. A greenhouse, for example, the glass is transparent to visible light, but it doesn't let all the infrared energy out as well as it lets the light in. So that allows the heat to stay within the greenhouse and lets us grow things in colder temperatures than we otherwise would be able to do. Now, there's an even more interesting aspect of that is that our planet's atmosphere does the very same thing. For centuries, it's been known that our planet should probably have been about minus 18 degrees Celsius on average, based on how much sunlight we get. But there must have been something in the atmosphere that contributed to allow it to be about plus 15 degrees Celsius on average for the temperature of our planet. So this smart guy was the one who helped figure out what it was. It's not the oxygen or the nitrogen, which make up the vast majority of our atmosphere. It's these small amounts of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, which is in parts per million, and methane, although much more potent, has a much smaller concentration, it's parts per billion. But these are the gases that absorb that infrared energy, just like the greenhouse. This smart guy was the one who helped to actually calculate mathematically how much energy is stored by the results of these greenhouse gases. And he came up with this equation, which is actually referred to as the greenhouse equation. And then this smart guy, who actually was born in Montreal, was the one who realized we've been adding more greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide and some methane, since the Industrial Revolution started in the 18th century. And as a result, the planet should be warming. He was the first one to actually suggest that. Just to summarize then, we've got this blanket, this blue blanket of greenhouse gases that allows some of the infrared to get through, but absorbs some of it. If we thicken that blanket by adding greenhouse gases, then we're going to keep in some of that infrared and warm the planet and all of the consequences therein. So that was in the 30s that first concept came up with. In the 50s, these two guys, Revell and Keeling, decided we better start measuring our carbon dioxide levels to see what's happening. And so ever since 1958, they've been recording it. And in fact, I downloaded this morning. Since it's in Hawaii, it's a time difference behind us, and they didn't yet have the the April 7 data up, but it's been rising by about 2 parts per million every year. You can see there's a natural rise and fall with the seasons. In the summer, when photosynthesis kicks in, then it starts to drop, but in the winter it climbs, but you can see it's a steady climb. And then because we have little trapped pockets of air in ice cores, we can confirm exactly what the concentrations of carbon dioxide have been over the last 10,000 years. And as you can see, it was pretty steadily between about 270 and 280 parts per million. We've added about 50% of that now, and we're about 415. What are the consequences? Well, as I said, that's what helps trap heat. If we define the average temperature of our planet based on the 1950 to 2000 average, and you can see that 2020, the whole calendar year, was much hotter on average than the rest of the years have been. There's a few little pockets that are cooler than average, but by and large, it's all shades of red. In fact, 2020 tied the 2016 with the hottest year ever recorded. And you can see it's been a steady climb for the last 50 years. And the last 6 years are the hottest 6 years ever on record, since accurate records were kept as of about 1880. We start to see some crazy records being broken. Here 3 years ago, the North Pole was 28 degrees centigrade higher than it should have been for a typical day. Last year, Antarctica recorded its hottest temperature ever, 18.3 degrees Celsius. And if we want to try and get something very contemporary, I just got this week. Japan just recorded its earliest cherry blossom bloom in over 1,000 years. So we continue to see these records be broken as a result. There are some naysayers and skeptics out there who don't believe the science is settled. I'm just going to have to respectfully disagree, and I don't have time to go through why they're incorrect about that. But I will point out that, sure, there's lots of places to publish information on the internet, or even some journals that are not very well respected or peer reviewed. But if you look at all of the articles that have been written on climate change, 1/10 of 1% is all that actually rejects that we're the fault of it because of our greenhouse gas emissions. But some people would just rather listen to the reassuring lie than the inconvenient truth. But the truth is, we are causing this problem. So now let's delve into what the impacts are on our health. Obviously, a hotter planet means there's going to be more heat waves. And some of them have been quite deadly. Here was one where 1,200 people died in Pakistan at one point in June of 2015. And not surprising that some of these records that are being broken, like 54 degrees Celsius, are going to be hard on folks. Who is it hardest on? Well, the people who are most vulnerable to heat are the people who are actually most vulnerable to pretty much any kind of health stress. This list would apply to who's most vulnerable to COVID, for example. The poor, the extremes of age, those with pre-existing medical conditions, especially cardiac and respiratory issues. Another consequence is not just heat, but floods. We see floods like crazy. I could show you an hour's worth of slides on just floods alone. I like showing this one because this is an emergency department in the Philippines. Hard to imagine working up to your knees in water. But if we just focus even on Canada, we've seen lots of flooding all across the country. BC, Alberta, record-breaking floods that have been occurring. If we want closer to home, here's the GO train in Toronto. This is really close to home because this is my cottage on Mary Lake. In 2013, we had the highest recorded water levels in the last 80 years. You can see it got to the second board on my boathouse. And not to be outdone, just 2 years ago, we had an even worse flood where we got to the third board. So we're seeing these floods. But why? Why is there so much water and flooding and downpours that are happening across the planet? Basic elementary school science teaches you about how water evaporates from sources of water like oceans and streams and rivers and lakes, and then it gets up into the atmosphere, and sometimes it precipitates as rain. If that air mass moves to some colder climate, then it might precipitate as snow. But this is the cycle, this hydrological cycle. The atmosphere, for every degree it's hotter, will allow 7% more moisture to be absorbed. So we start getting these crazy floods. Droughts, another thing. I've pointed out how the atmosphere absorbs moisture from bodies of water, but it doesn't just get its moisture from there. In fact, even more quickly, it will absorb moisture from land. Whereas we're having some areas that are getting too much water, we're having a lot of areas that aren't getting enough, and they start having these dry spells, record breaking, like this is a lake bed in China, or this one in Indiana. They're breaking records again more than a century old when they're just having such conditions. Another important aspect of climate change is what happens with infectious diseases. A lot of diseases are spread via what we call vectors. So a mosquito, for example, or a tick. But there's lots of vectors out there that can help spread disease. And when the climate is changing, their habitats are changing and they start to move into other areas that they previously didn't. For example, sure, some of the spread of these tropical diseases is due to us having a relatively small planet now that you can travel easily anywhere. But a lot of it has to do with what the vectors are doing and where they're going that they previously didn't, so that these tropical diseases are now happening in less tropical areas. Partly because the vectors, like a mosquito, for example, for malaria, can start to move farther north or farther south from the tropics, or to higher elevations, places that are normally too cool for that to occur. Also, the transmission season can be longer because of the way the planet has been warming. So malaria is a deadly one that's really been affecting the planet, but you might go, well, how does that affect me here in central Ontario? Well, it affects other things too, like Lyme disease, which is a deer tick, the vector for that one. And the same sort of thing happens there as well. Another aspect, water and food security and what we're going to do with that. The problem here is that a lot of our crops are struggling to get through this hotter climate than they used to. And so we expect that the price of these staple foods is going to double in the next 20 years as a result of that. In fact, we've seen good evidence of that before. There's two spikes here you can see that were within a span of 3 years where the crops were struggling because of the particularly hot summers. And as a result, the prices increased substantially just because of that more in demand. Now, here's a really good example. In 2003, Europe had a heat wave that was considered a 1 in 10,000 years. 70,000 people died. That was the main headline. But it didn't get as much attention to what happened to the agriculture. So maize decreased by 30%, fruit by 25%, grains by 30%, and one really close to home, the wine production, was the lowest it had been in 10 years. The costs from agriculture lost alone was 4 billion euros to France that year because of that extreme heat wave. Air quality is another one. The problem, of course, partly because when we're burning fossil fuels, we put all these particulates in the atmosphere. We're causing a lot of pollution. It's a little bit different from climate change. And if you ever have somebody who argues against doing anything to help climate change, nobody should be in favor of air pollution. So if we do the same measures that help climate change, we'll actually help our air pollution. But you can see here that it's expected 10 years from now that 90,000 people will have died in Canada just from the effects of air pollution alone, and 710,000 from long-term exposure. And that's a big deal because most respiratory illnesses, more than half, are related to the quality of our air. And 8% of Canadian children suffer from asthma. So that's just the air pollution and air quality from that perspective. But there are things that the climate change has contributed to air quality, such as the amount of pollen per cubic meter is going to almost triple in the span of 40 years because of a hotter atmosphere. Wildfires and all of the stuff that comes from that also affect air quality. And we are seeing, you hear about wildfires in California, you hear about them in Australia. I could again show you an hour's worth of slides of just that alone, but they've been quite dramatic. And of course, we've had our share in Canada, like in BC and in Alberta, and even just a few years ago, the Fort McMurray one. They look like they're scenes from a movie, but this is actually the reality of what happens when you have hot and dry conditions at the same time. Now, those are mostly the physical impacts of climate change and what it can do, but what about the psychological impacts? And those are substantial. There's obviously some direct impacts, like if you lose your house to a flood or to a wildfire and your community is devastated, well, then that's a direct impact. There are slightly less direct impacts, like perhaps your community has been hurt, but you yourself haven't lost a house, but that still has a huge impact on you. Or maybe your job security is threatened because of what's happened with it. And then there's a completely indirect impact that we still see a lot of people struggling with, because a lot of people are sensitive and care, and they are upset when they hear about things happening elsewhere in the planet. You know, if you're an animal lover, you may be worried about the habitat of polar bears, or the fact that some species are being threatened with extinction because of climate change. So that causes a lot of emotional stress for people as well. And then just to list a few other impacts may not have crossed your mind. If you work outdoors in the summer, that's going to be tough the hotter it gets. We're starting to reach temperatures in the 40s for Celsius for Canada. That'll be a struggle. Or climate refugees. About 10% of the global population live near coasts. And when those coasts start to flood as a result of sea level rise that's going to occur, that's going to be a problem. And these people are going to have to move elsewhere. We're already seeing that in some places, but we're going to start seeing more of it. Of course, extreme weather events lead to power outages, and that's a struggle for a lot of people, a lot of businesses, even healthcare facilities. Everything requires electricity. And conflict. This is a real potential one. You know, for years we've been used to wars being fought over places where there's a lot of petroleum to drill for. But fresh water may become a real rare and precious commodity. Canada having, I think, about 20% of the world's fresh water, we may be a country that's going to have to deal with conflict as people try and get our precious resources. Some people say we can adapt because we've been pretty good at adapting to various things in the past as a species. I'm not sure that's the right answer, although sure, we'll obviously have to adapt as best as we can. But, we've been addicted to coal. And as a result, now that coal is tougher to get in some places, we carved it out of mountains. We've been addicted to natural gas. And because we're starting to lose some sources there, we start fracking and going forward in shale, which unfortunately lets it get into the water table. We've been addicted to petroleum, to oil. And as a result, maybe it's not so easy to get from Texas or the Middle East anymore. So we start drilling offshore. Or we start carving up Canada's beautiful boreal forest in Alberta to get the bitumen from the tar sands there. Now let's talk about the solutions. We've covered the science and we've covered what the actual problems are and how they impact our health. The solutions, some of them are just obvious. Stop carving up the boreal forest, stop chopping down trees, stop burning fossil fuels. But let's get into a few more practical perspectives that we can offer. And in broad strokes, we want to be more efficient with the energy we use. We want to convert to greener sources of energy, and we want to try and conserve and be more careful and less wasteful of the resources we use now. Just to talk on some of the green sources of electricity, obviously solar panels are a great one. I like to show this picture because I figure if a conservative organization entrenched in tradition, such as the Vatican, can move forward with something like solar panels, then so can everybody else. I like to show this too because Vatican City was the first country in Europe to actually completely come off the grid and not use fossil fuels at all for its sources of electricity. Now, to be fair, it had two good advantages on its side. One was that there are only 800 people who live in the Vatican, so it's a much smaller country. And number two, God was helping. Another one, of course, wind turbines. We have a lot of sources of wind. Offshore is one. And there's a large corridor right through the center of North America, right from Texas up through the prairies, and we can harness that wind and create energy. These last two pictures I showed you, by the way, the two highest increase in jobs right now is solar panel technician and wind turbine mechanic. In Ontario as well as Quebec, we're fortunate we have a lot of hydroelectricity to generate, which is much greener than burning fossil fuels. But there's still a lot of places elsewhere in the world that could benefit from using it a bit more as well. Some of the things we can do, practically speaking, food is a really big source to think about. First of all, obviously it makes sense to eat local, because if your food didn't have to travel 4,000 kilometers to get to you, then it obviously has a much better carbon footprint. But the sources of food you eat are important too. And I'll illustrate that in the next slide. Reducing meat consumption is important. As a cardiologist, I'll say we could all benefit from eating less meat. I'm not advocating people be vegan or even vegetarian, but I think if we could start eating less, like having a meatless Monday, for example, would be good. Because just look at this. If we talk about the top line there for beef, 2.2 pounds, which is a kilogram, costs 4,100 gallons of water, and it ends up emitting 35 pounds of carbon dioxide, requires 9.5 square yards of land to do, and you get about 2,500 calories out of that. If you drop down to wheat, down towards the bottom, you'll see that it only needs 340 gallons of water. It only generates 1.8 pounds of emissions for CO2, only uses 1.8 square yards of land, and also has 3,400 calories of energy that it provides. So it's much, much better for the carbon footprint if we get away from some of the meat. Another important one, we've talked about how we're chopping down trees to develop land or to get the bitumen in Alberta from the soil. But it's funny, some people will say, if there was only some cheap, easy invention we could have that would help take CO2 out of the atmosphere. It would have to be easy, it would have to sort of sustain itself. And it's like, well, welcome to trees, because that's exactly what they do. They breathe in the carbon dioxide as part of the photosynthesis process. And trees could really be a huge part of the solution globally if we start to manage our forests better. We'll get us more than a third of the way to our target of keeping our planet under the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase that we're headed towards. Each tree stores 22 kilos of carbon dioxide per year. So they're very important as part of this. Entire forests, if they're large enough, like what we have in Canada, can offset the entire emissions of some countries, like in Europe. You might say, well, isn't that a Herculean task to try and get so many trees out there? Now that we have drone technology, we see it in sports and entertainment all the time that they use their drones. 10 drones can plant 400,000 trees in a day because they fire these seed missiles into the ground. So it is definitely doable and within our capability. Another thing you can do is learn more. I'm not trying to shill my own book here, but if you're interested in it, I always have copies for sale and you can get it on Amazon or Chapters online as well. I cover obviously a lot more than what a 30-minute talk can address. And Chris Hadfield actually did endorse it when he was asked to pick 6 books that he thought were worth reading that were in the nonfiction category. He picked mine as one of the 6, so that was very nice of him. Thank you, Chris. Get involved. That's another important thing. You heard that I'm involved in Climate Reality, which is sort of the Al Gore army that helps try and get the message across and tries to lobby politicians about things. We also have groups locally, like there's a group of physicians in Barrie who appreciate the impacts of health from climate change. And we've talked to city council, for example. There's ways to get involved. And Margaret Mead had this beautiful quote in the past. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Starting at the grassroots is very important. If somebody asked me what is the number one thing I can do to make a difference, I would say it would be to elect people who are going to change policy, because changing laws is more important than changing light bulbs. We've struggled with this because we have these, Kyoto and Copenhagen Accords and all the Paris treaties. We have these world leaders who kind of keep seeming to defer things. Yes, we'll agree to sign a pledge, to hold another meeting, to consider changing course at a date. We're headed towards this iceberg of climate change if we don't act now. The problem is politicians are motivated by various things, not always what's best, especially not for the long term, so much as maybe just the next election cycle. I'm not using this slide to illustrate any kind of political allegiance one way or the other. I just want to point out that there's a lot of politicians out there who say carbon tax is wrong and they try and make it seem scary. But who should you listen to about an economic decision like carbon tax? Well, I think economists, not politicians. And who are the smart economists? Well, how about the ones that win Nobel Prizes? Like these 2 guys, William Nordhaus and Paul Romer in 2018. They won the Nobel Prize for economics. Why? Because the work they did said that one of the very best efficient solutions to the problem is if we put a global scheme of carbon tax. To be fair, it really needs to be across the planet so that not one country is being hit compared to others. But the smartest experts in economics globally believe that that is the right thing to do. Can we do this? I have fluctuated in my 15-year journey dealing with climate change. I fluctuate through periods of optimism and pessimism. I will say this past year, I've been a little bit more pessimistic because of the pandemic. Because we all know the measures that we can take to try and reduce spread. Hand hygiene is good and important. Social distancing, staying at home like we're now in this lockdown in Ontario, and something as simple as wearing a mask so that we don't spread our aerosolized droplets from one person to another. And yet, we've had so many people fight that very, very simple step. It's not expensive, it's not hard to do, and yet a lot of people fought it. So if they can't agree with this, how can we expect them to maybe start doing the right thing, like buying electric cars and changing their eating habits and starting to maybe burn less fossil fuels if they can by buying other sources of electricity for their homes? And so it's going to be a challenge for sure for the planet. But I use this slide purposefully to be dramatic because in the end, when there's a global crisis, the nations of the world do come together to help eliminate it. And I have no doubt that our planet will ultimately come together and make the right changes for climate to fight the climate crisis. The question really is going to be, how long is that going to take before those efforts are really properly done? And how many lives are going to be affected or lost while we wait to get there? Obviously, we'd like to get this done as soon as possible, but it will eventually happen. We ultimately do the right thing in the end. As one parting thought before I go, I'd like to point out all of the benefits that will happen as a result of making the changes that are required to fight the climate crisis. For example, fossil fuels are not going to be around forever, so someday we're going to have to deal with some other source of electricity. And I don't think it's fair for us to just say, that's a future generation's problem. Likewise, clean air, the jobs that are created, for all of this stuff that happens. And yet, of course, that's the good question. If it's a big hoax, are we just creating a better world for nothing? I like to think no, but of course it's not a hoax. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate the opportunity to share this information with you.
And thank you, Dr. Dibble. That was such an enlightening presentation. And for me, when I think of climate change, we think about the effects of the planet or the wildlife that has been hurting it. And we seldom think about ourselves. So it's really enlightening that you've put all of these different pieces in motion and triggered some really good ideas that many of us may not be thinking about directly. I will send a recommendation, hopefully to our library, about your book that you have mentioned here. It looks really interesting. For those who would like that book titled again, it's called Comprehending the Climate Crisis. which has won several awards. And we're going to open up the floor for discussions. A lot of comments about seeing the effects on the current climate. The cherry blossoms are already blooming. I see my tulips already popping up, and it's like the first week of April. Are we seeing any changes with this pandemic? As cars on the road, it might be too soon to see some of the impact that we're having on the environment and on our health. But do you think there would be any changes from the pandemic?
That's an excellent question. The short answer is no, I don't think we're going to see any change as a result of the pandemic, because even if we turned off all of our emissions today, there's enough in the atmosphere already that are going to continue to keep the planet warming. We may be set for a really bad situation in the future, even if we keep our emissions down. So the one change we did know when things were affected last year, and for example, air travel was reduced, we did see a transient drop in our CO2 levels briefly, but that very quickly bounced back. And as you saw, I showed the Scripps data, that healing curve. There was no observable blip globally with respect to what happened with our emissions. Unfortunately, there are some feed-forward loops that are happening as a result, as I say, even if we turn off our emissions. So for example, a warmer planet means the ice cap at the North Pole is getting smaller. So as a result, there's less white up there because the ice cap is smaller, so less light is being reflected, more is being absorbed by the blue ocean. Or we're starting to melt permafrost, and methane is released from that. So there's some emissions that are continuing to happen even if we stop. So unfortunately, no, it's going to take much more Herculean effort than a pandemic reducing our travel plans to make the change we need.
Now, if we all got our acts together, we started eating locally, eating better foods, doing our part about the environment and doing that control, do you think there's a way that we can reverse this warming trend, or is it irreversible at this point in time?
I'm optimistic about our species, and I do think that we will come up with something better than just planting trees, even though, as I pointed out, that's a very valuable part of it. I think we will come up with some technology that will help to scrub carbon dioxide in the future that'll make a difference. I think the mistake people would say, though, is they're going to rely on that to the point they don't even need to make the changes now that we talked about. So let that be one component of the solution, but don't count on it being the only component of the solution.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dibble, for coming today and talking to us about this amazing topic. It's been a pleasure hearing from you about the climate change on our health and what we can do about it.